In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God saw that the light was good. Sometimes it takes us a little while to recognize when something's wrong. It could have been obvious to so many. There could have been signs. There could have been warnings along the way, but sometimes we just can't see it until we see it. And then once we do, once we recognize that something is wrong, comes the hard part. After all, that's when the choice comes. Do we admit that we see it? And in so doing, admit our own culpability in allowing that wrong to persist? Or do we bury our heads in the sand and pretend like we don't see it? As a people of faith, of course, we know what we're called to do. We know the right choice. But if we're honest, we also know the choice we more often make. It's much easier to just not look, to pretend like we didn't see it, to not shine light into those dark corners. But as we know from hard experience, that doesn't mean that they go away, though sometimes we go through heroic efforts to not turn our heads and see, to keep those corners in the dark, forgetting that from the very beginning, God said that the light was good. The last couple of weeks have been some of the hardest in recent memory. Many of us have watched with horror the brutality too often perpetrated against people of color. We've watched people take to the streets and to cry out and wondered what is going on. Sure, some of us have seen this before. Some of us recognized it was there, though some of us are just now seeing it. The challenge, of course, is that just because we don't see something doesn't mean it hasn't been there. This pandemic has laid bare a deeper disease in our world that no simple vaccine can cure. A world that for too long has allowed systemic and structural racism to take root, sometimes by good people. That's the thing. You don't have to be a bad person to be a racist. It used to be that way, or at least seemed that way. 50 years ago, we could point to particular people and say, oh, clearly they're the racist ones. They were the ones wearing the sheets or carrying the rope or sicking their dogs. They were the ones using abhorrent language that we still, if we're listening, can hear today. Now, though, it's much more insidious, isn't it? Now the racism that we see in the world has too often been ignored by people who look like me, people who are convinced that it either doesn't exist or that if it does, it is not something that I'm a part of. For too long, we've convinced ourselves that so long as we personally believe that all people are to be treated equally, so long as we have black friends, so long as we put up some signs, so long as every once in a while we participate in a protest, that we are not a part of the problem. But friends, something is still wrong. I live in a world where, because of the color of my skin, I don't have to think about the color of my skin, but that is not a universal experience. I've been pulled over a few times in my life, more than I should probably admit to my congregation, for, going about the Lord's work too quickly. And while every time I have been fearful of getting a ticket, I've never been fearful for my life. I can walk through almost any neighborhood without people giving a second thought, even if I'm wearing a hoodie. I could walk my dog if I had one, or watch birds without fear of someone calling the police. I can walk through a store without someone following me, and if I ever did need to call law enforcement, I could be almost assured that they will come and, even better, be on my side. When I go and watch television, with a few exceptions, I'm watching shows created by people who look like me. With a few exceptions, when I go to the voting booth, my choices are between people who look like me, with the exception of 1 month a year. The history that is taught to my children is about people who look like me. I didn't come from money, but the color of my skin has never kept me from earning it. Do you see? I am a part of racism. I don't want to be. I could pretend like I'm not, but it's not true. I am a part of racism. For too long, we've pretended that so long as we just have good feelings towards people of different colors, that suddenly that we don't have to worry about the waters in which we swim, but those are the waters that we're swimming in. We've held our noses at the idea of privilege as if it somehow implies that we got something we didn't earn, but the truth is, we did. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't. We did. And the North doesn't get a pass on this. We like to look down our nose at the South, but lest we forget, we are sitting in a city named for a slaveholder, in a country built on the torture, rape, and forced labor of African Americans. We don't like to admit it, but it is true. In 1801, the average enslaved person could pick 28 pounds of cotton in a day. 28 pounds, that is a lot of cotton. 50 years later, the average enslaved person was picking 132 pounds a day, some as many as 340. 50 years, 28 pounds to 132 pounds, during which time there was not a single mechanical innovation. It was simply done by torture. It was that crop increase in the nascent years of our country on which this economy was built, in which banks were fed, and the white middle class was born. We are now 167 years, 6 months, and 7 days from the Emancipation Proclamation, and reparations have yet to be made. There was no 40 acres and a mule as our own Frederick Douglass envisioned. Instead, as Martin Luther King Jr. so eloquently and brutally honestly put it, slaves were simply left illiterate, penniless, and told, "You're free." It's akin to allowing one group to start the Indianapolis 500 without a car, and when everyone else has already gone to lap 400. Sure, they're on the same track, but what chance do they have to catch up? And if this were just a historic issue, we might be having a different conversation, but as we know, friends, it's not. Look around. By almost every meaningful measure, this difference between black and white in this country is sinful. Pick your poison. Housing, health, income, education, life expectancy. In some cases, the difference between black and white is literally the difference between life and death. We have locked up an entire generation, turned the key, and forgotten all about them. Do you see? there is something wrong. And now we have a chance to face it. Yes, this is hard to talk about. The truth be told, I'd rather talk about almost anything else because it's hard to do, and I'm terrified I'm going to say the wrong thing. I may have already, but you know what? In the end, I'd rather speak imperfectly for justice than to stay silent in the face of injustice, because silence in the face of injustice is its own sort of violence. And friends, we've had too much of that through the centuries. Something is wrong, and it's time for it to stop. The cycle has to end somewhere. Why not with us? We can't go back and undo all of the wrongs of the past. We can't unring the bell. We can't undo the hurt. We can't unshed that blood. But by the grace of God, every moment is a chance to begin again. We can't go all the way back to the beginning of creation, but we can remember the promise that was made there and hold on to it until now. We know the story, don't we? In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, it's beautiful. It tells the story of 6 days in which all of creation was made and 1 day in which God rested. That's the furthest most people ever get in their Bibles, those who bother to open them. It's a beautiful story, one in which at the end of every day of creation, God looks out and sees that it is good. We could use the reminder, couldn't we? That creation is good. Only most of us don't ever hear it because we get so obsessed with the science of this story. We ask, how could the world be created in 6 days? What about evolution? What about the Big Bang? What about dinosaurs? We have all these questions that come up when we begin to look at this story, pitting science and faith against each other. But this was never meant as a scientific account, nor even a historic one. It was always and is always, will always be, a theological account. It is a story, a true story. It doesn't have to have happened for it to be true. About who we are. Do you see? Science asks the question how, faith asks the question why. We ignore it at our own peril. The story is a reminder that from the very beginning of time, from the very beginning, we have all been good. Fortunately for us, it didn't stop at day 6. It's just that somewhere after that, somewhere after day 6, wherever it happened to fall, we stopped seeing that goodness in each other. And when it happens over and over again, century by century, it matters, and people need to remind us. People begin to cry out when they are not seen as good. Maybe we've heard that cry recently. Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. It is a creation call. Yes, all lives matter, but to respond that way is to ignore 400 years of systemic and systematic oppression, torture, and rape. It is to ignore what they are crying out for us to hear. It is to ignore the call of creation itself. So before we flippantly respond, all lives matter, we ought to hear what is being told to us. Black lives matter, a reminder to those who look like me that sometimes we need to stop and listen to what is being told to us. There's precedent for that in the story as well. Remember, in the story at the end of the week, it's day 7 that everyone was asked to rest. People were created day 6 in the story, and on day 7 they were asked to rest. They hadn't done anything to earn it. It goes against our Protestant work ethic, but that's the way it goes. Maybe from the very beginning of time, God was pausing and asking us to pause as well, to remind us that it is not about us. That pausing is not about appreciating everything that we have done, but stopping to recognize what God has done and what God is doing. And friends, we'll never hear it, we'll never see it if we don't stop long enough to actually hear. If our knee-jerk response to Black Lives Matter is to say all lives matter, we are missing the point. Before we jump to what we think needs to happen, perpetuating a long tradition in which people who look like me have always stepped in with a solution. Maybe we ought to stop long enough to actually hear the cries. As Martin Luther King III said this week, protests are a sign that people are not being heard. Before we do more harm, let us stop and listen. This has been a hard 2 weeks, coming off of a hard couple of months, and the truth is, it may just be the beginning. But maybe it can be the beginning of something good. Maybe we can use this time, friends, so that at the end of this moment, we will have a better world to embrace. The good news is that even if we fail, even if we get it wrong again, by the grace of God, every moment of every day is a chance to begin again. And so, my friends, until we get it right, may it be so. Amen.